Hey guys, I have a question for you to start this lecture. And that question is, what makes someone a software engineer? So this question is something that I definitely want to address tonight and want to explore throughout all 8 weeks of Lambda School's Web Dev 101. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself, and I'd love to hear from you guys in Slack about what you think makes someone a software engineer. And then we'll come back and explore that in just a second. So my name is Deandra Ryan Moss. I'm an instructor at Lambda School. I've technically been programming since I was 14 when I started messing around with HTML and CSS in order to have the coolest MySpace of everyone in my high school freshman class. I'm not sure if I succeeded or not, but I did learn some cool stuff. And programming was kind of a part of my life ever since then. My background's in math, but I did a lot of coding in college. I ended up going through a web development boot camp of my own after college. I worked as a software engineer for 2 years in the industry, but I honestly really love teaching. So here I am at Lambda School, and I get to share my knowledge and sometimes my lack of knowledge with all of you guys in this course. So it's great to have you guys tonight. I unfortunately don't see any responses to my question yet in Slack, but some people are typing, so I'm feeling optimistic. I will just say that I love crowd participation in Slack, so definitely be in the Slack channel if you're watching this live. And I'm not always able to see and respond to everything you say, but I really like seeing that people are engaged and involved and answer any questions I can as we go. So still waiting for some responses on that. So I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about Lambda School first, and then we'll come back to it. So Lambda School is really cool. It's a pretty revolutionary school in a couple different ways. So first of all, there's kind of been this appearance of boot camps on the scene lately, which are a more non-traditional path to a career, but honestly a really good way to go because you spend less time and learn more practical skills. But what makes Lambda School extremely special is, in my opinion, two things. The first is that, and really both are oriented towards being accessible to anyone who wants to learn. So the first thing is that it is entirely online, which I personally appreciate because I live in Bisbee, Arizona, which is like the edge of the universe. So I'm able to work at this awesome school from wherever I want, and you guys are able to attend this awesome school from wherever you are. So it's using all sorts of lecture tools and group work tools, chat tools. We're able to have this full-time school entirely online. The second thing that makes Lambda School extremely special is the tuition model. Once again, this is something that makes it accessible to tons of people. So in a lot of these boot camps, you have to shell out this giant sum of money to get in. That was the case for me. That was the case for a lot of people I know who went through other schools. But with Lambda School, it's a de-risked education model, which means that you do not have to pay anything up front. You'll pay back your tuition only after you are hired. That means that if you do not get that job that you're working towards, you don't have to pay anything. As it were, we have really great curriculum. We have a really great hiring team when you're finished. So we feel pretty good about you getting that job and us getting paid. But you don't have to pay anything up front. So the risk is on us. So that's a little bit about Lambda School. Throughout Lambda School, we'll teach you the ins and outs of web development, which we'll talk more about tonight, what that actually is. So you'll learn all these practical skills that will help you on the job, as well as some more computer science-oriented skills, such as algorithms and learning some other languages like Python and C. So that's Lambda School in a nutshell. I'll be talking a bit more about it every single night. If you are interested in applying, please reach out to Karen Zachary in Slack. She is the person to talk to. She's super nice. Go talk to her. Even if you're like really on the fence, just talk to her. It's better to have more information. And so if you feel either ready to start that admissions process right now, reach out to her. If it's something you want to do after this mini course, reach out to her too. So she is great. Okay, well, I see a ton of things in Slack right now, so I'm going to do a little scrolling and see what some people have said. So I'm just going to grab a few random responses here. So Aaron says that software engineers are people who know how to talk to computers, so they will create whatever one is trying to communicate via the internet or other computer source, such as apps or games. Really good practical definition of it. We have one that says it varies depending on the job. Definitely also true. Sherlock Holmes with a computer. There's a bit of a more detailed description of planning, design, code, more code, module testing, debugging, certification. I see one that software engineers are people who use software to solve important puzzles, and software is the tool they use and the thing they create. So yeah, I'm seeing, oh, this one's good. An engineer creates answers. Okay, so I really like these responses because they deal with two different parts of being a software engineer that I think are both really critical. The first is the practical side. Yes, software engineers build things using code, so they have to know how to use code so they can build things. Of course, we're going to deal with that in this mini bootcamp and also in the Lambda School main curriculum. But there's something really critical too that I'm glad that some of you guys addressed, and that's this idea of software engineers as problem solvers. So I think that the more important skill in being a software engineer than literally knowing code is this being able to face the unknown, this being able to have something that originally doesn't make a lot of sense and is maybe extremely overwhelming, and patiently tinkering with it until it does. So we're going to come back to this again throughout the lesson tonight, but I want you to keep this in mind as we go along, because I think that it's really easy to get caught up in the, well, I have to learn X, Y, and Z mentality. But keep in mind that the most important thing that you're going to be learning both in this 8-night course and in the Lambda main curriculum is this ability to cope with the unknown and to play around with something unfamiliar until it starts to become familiar. So I hope to give you a taste of that tonight and plenty of tastes of that in the nights to come. All right, so let me talk a little bit more about this Web Dev 101, this free course that you're in that we're starting tonight. So for starters, just a little lay of the land. It is an 8-night course. It's going to be Monday through Thursday this week, Monday through Thursday next week. So it's just 4 nights. I love it when you guys can attend live and interact in Slack and all of that, but we do make it available if you can't take it in real time. All these lectures will be on YouTube. All the homework will be available as well. We'll talk more about that later. So let's talk about literally what we're doing here. And I'm going to go ahead and send out the syllabus in Slack. I sent it out earlier, but you can check it out, and then we'll look at that on screen once I share my screen in just a minute here. So give me 1 second to send that out in Slack. There it is. Okay. So just sent out the syllabus, but let me talk about what we're doing here. So as just mentioned with this idea of what does it mean to be a software engineer, the first thing we're doing is we're really learning how to learn. We're learning how to explore complex ideas that may seem overwhelming at first and then slowly start to make sense as we play with them. The next piece is we're learning actual technical skills. So from a technical perspective, this mini bootcamp, this Web Dev 101 class, is oriented towards front-end web development. We'll talk more about what that means in just a minute. So we'll be exploring 3 different languages. Tonight, we're going to explore HTML. Tomorrow, we're going to explore a little more HTML and CSS. And then moving on from Wednesday of this week all through next week, we're going to be looking at JavaScript, which is a programming language and takes a little bit more of an in-depth dive to explore. And so all 3 of these languages are the key building blocks of front-end web development. So in the Lambda main curriculum, you'll be learning the full stack of web development. We'll once again talk more about what that means a little later. But in this mini bootcamp, we'll be starting with just those 3 languages. And as far as what you need to know coming in, we are starting at 0 in this course. Admittedly, life will be a little easier if you do have experience in any of these 3 languages or other languages, but we do start at 0. So if you have absolutely no coding experience, that's totally fine. We will explain everything from the bottom up. As far as some other things to keep in mind, I already mentioned Slack. Please be on Slack. I love it when you guys are on Slack. I do not monitor the chat on YouTube, unfortunately, because I'm only capable of paying attention to like 2 things at once, and that would be 3 things. So I'm sorry, I don't watch the chat on YouTube, but if you're on there, please move over to Slack and I will be able to see what you're saying. And at the end of each night, I will take questions from Slack as well. So really useful place to be during the lectures, really useful place to be outside of the lectures because we have people available in Slack to answer questions. So, and as well, you can talk to the other people in the class, run ideas off of them. So just 2 thumbs up for Slack, be in Slack. As far as the schedule for each night, we will have a lecture that starts at 5 o'clock Pacific time. That lecture goes between an hour to an hour and a half, depending on the lecture and the amount of questions. And then after that, there will be homework time. So you'll have about an hour for homework, and then following that, you'll get together in groups and discuss the homework. So I hope you guys all signed up with the Slack bot. There's a Slack bot that should have been prompting you for your name and your email. It's really important that you actually listen to that Slack bot and give it your info. That will put you in a group for the homework. So once again, please submit your info to that Slack bot. It will allow you to get your homework and work together with your group. It will assign you a project manager, which is someone from Lambda School who's your first point of contact for the homework. So definitely do that. If you're watching this on YouTube later, the best thing to do is to probably hop in the web after hours channel. So the after hours channel will be the place to go for the homework if you're doing it on your own time. But the formal schedule for the night is that you work on your homework immediately following the lecture. As mentioned, I know class is pretty long with the homework included, but we just do Monday through Thursday. So 2 weeks, Monday through Thursday. That will be our schedule. And once again, please pay attention to the bot, submit your info to the bot. Everything will be so much easier when homework time comes if you do that. A couple other things with homework, make sure that you have created for tonight a CodePen account. We'll talk more about that later. So create an account in CodePen and create one in Replit. We don't need Replit for tonight, but we will need it on Wednesday. So those 2 tools are going to be pretty critical for the homework. So make sure you have an account in both. So that is pretty much all of the housekeeping stuff. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I'll just briefly go over the syllabus. Hopefully you all got the link to that, and then we can actually jump into some fun coding stuff. So let's do that. I will share my screen now. All right, so here is the syllabus. We just have a little section for each of the nights. As you can see, we're gonna start out, tonight's more of an introductory lecture, so a lot more high-level conversation, a little bit less coding, but still some coding. And then tomorrow, HTML and CSS. And then as you can see, from Wednesday on, we're just gonna be talking about different topics in JavaScript. So lots of JavaScript. And then for each night, you can click over here and it'll give you a little bit more of a breakdown. So to give you a sense of what's going on tonight, as we already started to explore, we're going to start thinking like software engineers. We're going to explore what web development is and the role of these 3 languages that I've mentioned. And then finally, we're going to dive deeper into HTML itself and build ourselves a basic web page. So that is a little lay of the land for tonight. Feel free to follow along in here as well as consult it afterwards. A lot of the info I'll be going over tonight, as well as some extra stuff, is stored in this syllabus. So it is a pretty great tool if you guys want it. So that's the syllabus for you. Let's go ahead and actually dive into some coding now, because that is the fun thing. That is the thing that we are here to do. So, okay, let me pull up a bit of code for you to start. 1 second. Sorry, I have a million things open here. This is the one I wanted. Okay, thanks for your patience. All right, so here is a bit of computer code. This, first of all, we want to know what is literally open here. And so the application I have open is something called Sublime Text. So we're going to start by just talking about the very practical basic skill of where do we write our code. So I am using a text editor called Sublime Text. There are a bunch of free text editors online that are great. We recommend Sublime Text, Atom, VS Code, all good ones to check out. As it were, though, you don't actually need a text editor for this class. So I wanted to mention those because a lot of students like to download them and play around. They are something that you will for sure need in the main curriculum, but not actually a necessary thing for this class. So we love to use text editors to write code because they help us read our code a little better. Notice that some of these keywords are highlighted in this pink-red color. That makes it a lot easier to see what's going on here. So that was kind of this, maybe not the most exciting, but pretty critical part of coding is where do we write our code? As we'll see a little later, another option is to write code in a sandbox environment, which is what we'll be doing for the rest of this course. So I will explain in a bit more detail what a sandbox environment is. So by the end of tonight, you'll be super comfortable with sandbox environments and how to use them to write HTML code. But let's start with the code itself. So of course, I need somewhere to write it. And I have obviously written this code in advance. But what does this code do? Well, this code, as we can see, it's just a pretty small bit of code, only 7 lines, and it's doing something very specific. It's creating a web page, and that web page specifically has a header that says code example and a paragraph that says this is a paragraph on a web page. So using this bit of code, I have written out instructions for the computer that says create a web page with a header called code example and a paragraph that says this is a paragraph on a web page. So as was briefly mentioned in some of the responses about what is a software engineer is someone who uses code to communicate with the computer. And so in order to communicate instructions to the computer, whether they're super detailed instructions or something pretty simple like this basic web page, we need to write in a language. So the language that I have on screen right now is something called HTML. As mentioned, HTML is a building block of the web. It is what we use to create the content on our web pages. But there are tons of different languages. So as mentioned, we will explore 3 languages in this particular course. We're going to be exploring HTML, which will look like this, CSS, which looks slightly different, and JavaScript, which looks even more different. This language, HTML, is something called a markup language. So it's actually designed to render content, to display content, rather than to execute logic. So once we get into JavaScript, which is a programming language, we're going to see a lot of cool logic being executed. But with HTML and CSS, we're just going to be actually rendering content. So just basically saying, hey, here's our content and here's how we want it to look. So understanding the differentiation between a markup language and a programming language isn't super critical, but those are a couple terms I wanted to throw out for you here. So the steps to actually writing code are, of course, we need somewhere to write the code. We need to have some sort of task we're trying to accomplish, in this case, trying to create a simple web page. We need to understand the basics of the language we're working with, in this case, HTML. And then finally, we need to execute the code. So what that means is we need to turn this code that I've written that is pretty human readable into something the computer will understand. That's called compiling. So every single bit of code that is executed needs to at some point be turned into something a bit more human unreadable, like zeros and ones, that the computer can read. And don't worry, we won't actually literally see any zeros or ones this entire course. So you don't need to understand in detail what's going on. It's just nice to know that in order for these instructions to actually be read by the computer, they need to be executed in some way. And the method of executing a piece of code will just totally depend on what kind of code you've written and the context. But in the example of HTML, if I have an HTML file on my computer like this, I can open that using the browser. So the browser is actually designed to take HTML files and turn them into something computer readable. So even though that's happening behind the scenes, that's what happens when I open this file in my browser. So I can go over to Chrome. I can go ahead and just click File, Open File. And here I have my p index, that's the file we had open, and I'm just gonna open this in the browser. And voila, this code that I've showed you guys has now been taken from the HTML code. The browser behind the scenes has actually turned it into something that the computer can understand, zeros and ones, and then rendered it on screen as per our instructions. So these instructions I've written out of create a header and create a paragraph have now been realized over here in this very basic web page. So the takeaway here isn't necessarily to be an HTML master. We will break down what's going on in this HTML file in detail later, but it's more this idea of how do we think about code? Well, we need to write code, and in order to do that, we have to know what we're trying to accomplish, what language we're using, the ins and outs of the language, and then using that language, we can write a set of instructions about what we want, in this case, to appear on the page, or if we were writing with a programming language, we might be writing out a set of logical instructions to execute. Once we have our instructions written, we actually run our file, in this case by opening our file in the browser, and then we can see the instructions that we wrote out realized. And that's really the most basic formula for creating any bit of code. To go back to our syllabus here, I've outlined this out here of this idea that there are 3 steps, right? Understand the rules of the language, use those rules to construct a set of instructions, and then execute that program. So that's a really good model to keep coming back to, no matter what language we're using or what problem we're trying to solve. So in the interest of trying to think more like software engineers, that is a good place to start. So, okay. Now that we've seen a little example of a piece of code and what we can do with it, let's talk a little bit more about what computer programming is and what is possible with computer programming. So first of all, computer programming is the art of communicating with a computer to accomplish a task. And this was touched on by a few people earlier. And so we saw one task we might accomplish using code, for example, building a website. And of course, in this course, we will be focusing on building websites and web apps because it's a web development-oriented course. However, it's good to know that that's not where computer programming ends. We also might create an AI chess player. We might store or retrieve data from a database. Those are all also totally valid use cases for computer languages. So beyond trying to figure out what type of problem are we solving, the next question is really, what language do we use? So there are a lot of different languages out there. As mentioned, there are programming languages, things like JavaScript or PHP, C, C#, Java. As a little note, Java and JavaScript, different languages. I know that's super confusing because they're named so similarly, but totally different languages. So those computer programming languages are all logic-oriented, and they're pretty versatile. Almost any problem you could think up, you can solve using those types of languages. There are also markup languages like HTML, which we just saw. HTML is used to render content in some specific way. So you wouldn't really want to use HTML to try and build an AI chess player because that task is going to take a lot of logic and not any rendering of content. You could actually use JavaScript to create a web page, but that wouldn't be very efficient because HTML is really what's designed to do that. So you want to know different languages and have an idea of what types of tasks can be accomplished with what different types of languages. So once again, don't get too overwhelmed. There are a ton of languages out there, and we're really going to be focusing specifically on these 3 languages in the interest of solving this one problem, which is creating web content. So once we have a language in mind, we want to go and we need to learn it. The next question we really have to ask ourselves is, what is syntax? Or what is the syntax of the language? So if we go back to this HTML example, notice that there are all these symbols, there are these keywords that are glowing in this red, as well as some other text that I've written on here. And so Each language has a certain set of keywords and symbols and rules for putting those symbols together. We call that syntax. So syntax tells us how do we write the language. So writing instructions to a computer is a bit different than writing instructions to a human. If you were texting your mom instructions about how to get into your apartment and feed your cat, you could be a little vague. There are a lot of different ways you could word it. You could spell things wrong, and she would still probably get the instructions. They would make sense to her because we're talking to a human. But when we're talking to a computer, there's not a lot of wiggle room. So it's extremely important to be extremely precise. So when learning a new language, you really have to pay close attention to syntax, to what symbols are being used, what keywords, and how do we put them all together to correctly write out our set of instructions. So as we learn each of these 3 languages in more detail, I'll be giving a lot of time and attention to the syntax because getting that just right is really important. The good news is that there are tons of online resources available. So if you can't remember exactly how to write something, it's pretty easy to find examples online. And then the next thing I just want to mention again is this idea of running the code. So every bit of code, if we want the instructions to actually execute, need to be run. As with HTML, it turns out that the browser is designed to read HTML. However, if you were, for example, writing a program in Java, the process of actually executing your code would be a little different. You'd have to first compile it yourself, and then you would have to execute the code, whether it's from the command line or using a bit of software design to do that. So each type of code has a little bit of a different set of instructions for running it. Once again, it just kind of depends on the context. And with these 3 languages we'll be exploring in this course, I'll explain to you exactly how to run the code as we go along. So yeah, that is a little bit about computer programming, computer code, a little bit of a high-level overview of different types of languages, different tasks. So what's really cool is that even though we're focusing on web development in Lambda School, a lot of these skills you're learning and this ability to think about code is really applicable in other places. So for example, even though I'm not an AI expert, if I wanted to spend a couple weeks researching AI and learning more about it, I could pretty quickly pick up that new skill. So it's really great to learn your first set of languages because you're really doing a lot of the upfront work and the doors become open to whatever skill you want to learn in programming. But let's turn our attention over to web development because that is truly what we are here to do. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and and open up this little code base here. So I'll talk in a little more detail in just a minute about what a code base is. Actually, you know what? I'll just talk right now about what a code base is. So a code base is a collection of different files that work together to accomplish some sort of goal. So for example, this code base has 3 files in the 3 languages I've been talking about. So index.html, styles.css, and index.javascript. So these are 3 different files in 3 different languages that are all working together to create a web page. This web page specifically. No, oops. Actually, I don't have this one open. Let me open this one real quick. 1 second. Sorry about that. Codebase example. Okay, so let's go ahead and execute that index. So if we open it, let's try that again. Here we go. So I have now opened up this web page on the screen. So before we dive too much into detail of what's going on in this code base, let's talk a little bit about web content. So I'm going to derail us for just a second and bring us over to Lambda School's website. So as with all other web pages, this website was built using these 3 tools that we're going to be exploring over the next 8 nights. So let's talk a little bit about how each tool plays into it. Well, for starters, there's HTML. And so as I've been saying, HTML is the language that actually creates the content on the page. So what do I mean by content? Well, this background image would be considered content. This text is content. Pretty much actually all the text on here is content, as well as this little image up here, the Lambda logo. So using HTML, some developer for Lambda School has written out a set of instructions saying which bits of content should be on this page. So that, of course, is a critical piece of web development. The next piece is making sure that it looks good. So HTML just puts things on the page. It doesn't style them. That's what CSS is for. So CSS has actually told the computer how everything should look. For example, the instructions that this should be read were made using CSS. Notice that this bit of text is positioned kind of in a central location on the page. There's a little bit of space between this line and this line. There's a bit of space up here. There's space on the side. That is all that is all CSS. So CSS actually styles our page for us. The last piece is JavaScript. JavaScript happens a little more behind the scenes, and it makes our page dynamic. So it can be a little more subtle to see examples of JavaScript, but if you look closely, they're actually everywhere. So notice how when I hover over this button, it turns a slightly different shade of red. The changing color is created using JavaScript. So anything that changes dynamically on the screen is all JavaScript. Notice that if I hover over these buttons, that some drop-down menus appear. That's also JavaScript. So the content in the drop-down is going to be HTML, and the difference in colors is going to be CSS, but the fact that the page changes on an event, when I hover, the page actually changes slightly, that is JavaScript. So JavaScript is also used for something called the backend. So let me talk for a minute about the two components of web development, front-end web development and backend. As I mentioned at the beginning, in this 8-day course, we will be just covering the components of front-end web development. So let's talk about that first. Front-end is everything you see. So you as a user are pretty familiar with working with the front end of the web, even though you might not have had that term to use before tonight. So the front end is basically everything I just talked about. It's the content on the page, it's the style, it's the way that the page is dynamic, whether it's things changing like I showed you here, or for example, if you are on a social media platform like Twitter or Facebook and you submitted a post, or really filling out any sort of form and pressing a submit button, JavaScript would be used to actually submit that data. But that process of submitting data, pressing a button, that's all front end. So everything that you as a web user work with is the front end. But it turns out that you guys are no longer merely web users. You are now web developers, which means that you can't only think about the front end. We have to start thinking about the back end. So the back end is everything that happens behind the scenes. So behind the scenes, when you press submit, that data is actually going somewhere. It's going into a database where it's then going to be retrievable by all of your friends who want to see your post in their feed. As well, when you first load a page, if you're loading something like Twitter, all these posts will pop up. And the back end is where all the logic exists, which finds the correct posts and sends them out to you so they can be rendered on screen. So there's this whole world of database, data storage, data retrieval, data security when it comes to things like storing passwords, and that's all happening behind the scenes. And so now that we are web developers, we can't just think about the front end anymore. We also have to consider the back end. As it were, we won't be learning any back-end development in this course, but it is covered extensively in the Lambda School main curriculum. So it's good to be introduced to the ideas and to start to think about it now, because you'll be learning to code that back-end stuff soon in the main curriculum. So those are the two components of web development, front end and back end. And while we'll be focusing on front end in this course, learning JavaScript is a great way to prepare yourself for back end, because a lot of web backends are built on JavaScript. There are a couple more things with web development that I just want to mention. The first is something called a framework. I don't want to talk in too much detail about frameworks because we won't be going over them in this course, but they're pretty key for web development, and they're a big part of what we teach in the Lambda main curriculum. So languages often have sort of add-ons to them. For example, you might be writing CSS, but you're writing CSS using something called Bootstrap, which makes CSS a little more powerful. It is basically a shortcut that helps you build web content faster and easier. If you were writing something using JavaScript, you might be using a framework called Angular or React. Those frameworks, once again, allow you to write JavaScript in a way that lets you take shortcuts and has common web functionality already built in for you. So these frameworks aren't new languages, they're just add-ons to existing languages. And they're really important to learn because they make life a lot easier as a web developer. So I'll mention those a little more throughout this course, but we won't be learning any of them until the Lambda School main curriculum. So once again, just a term I wanted to get you familiar with so that you go into the main curriculum swinging and familiar with a lot of these terms. The next thing I wanted to mention just very briefly is specific challenges that web developers face. So every bit of programming brings up different challenges, and with web development, it's no different. So a couple things we have to think about with web development. First of all, appearance is very critical with web development. We want to make sure that we're creating beautiful, user-friendly sites. So user experience is a really key part of developing websites and web apps. The next piece is load time. So and this relates to user experience. No one wants to go to a web page and slowly watch it load. That was cool like 20 years ago, but no longer. So we have to write our code in specific ways that make sure that our pages load quickly. So that's something that we as web developers have to start considering when we're writing our languages. So just a couple of things to think about. Once again, not something we're going to be exploring a ton in this course, but really critical questions to start asking. All right, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about that code base that I popped up so that we can see some examples of these things that I've been discussing. So I'm going to open up this code base example page. So once again, we should be familiar with what is HTML, what is CSS, and what is JavaScript. But I want to make sure, I want to really grind this in. So we're going to go over it one more time. So on this page, we have, of course, HTML. We can see that there are words and a button on the screen. That is all going to be rendered using HTML. We can also see that there's some style. Notice that my header here is in some sort of special script font. We can see that the background is blue. We can see there's a border around this box and that there's some white space near the top of the screen and on the side. All of that is CSS. So all the appearance-oriented stuff on the page is going to be CSS. Finally, we have JavaScript. As you might have guessed, this button here that says Trigger JavaScript will show us some JavaScript. When I press the button, all of a sudden some hidden words appeared on the screen. Let me refresh that and do it again. So we see that the page has dynamically changed on an event. When I clicked a button, the appearance of the page changed. That's a good indication that you're dealing with JavaScript. So we see that all three building blocks of front-end web development are present in this simple little web page. So let's take a little peek at the code here. As you might imagine, we have an HTML file, we have a CSS file, and a JavaScript file. Of course, all three languages need to be present since we saw evidence of all three of them on the page. Just looking at the code here, we can see some examples of different syntaxes. So I want to come back to this idea of syntax. Every language has a different set of keywords and symbols and rules for putting them together. And we can see what that looks like on just a very visual level by looking at a couple different languages. So HTML is kind of built up of these little keywords in these brackets all put together. Just visually, we can see that that is a core part of writing HTML. And we're going to be talking a ton about that in just a minute when we dive in on how to write HTML. So using these little brackets, we've gone ahead and said, hey, put this header on the page. put this paragraph of text, here's this button and what the button should say. And so using these little tags, we've created HTML code. If we look over in our CSS file, we can see that it looks totally different. Once again, at this point, we're not necessarily trying to understand this code in detail, but just getting used to this idea that different languages have different syntax. So we can see maybe some of these same words that we saw in HTML, but totally different style brackets. We can see now that there are these sets of kind of symbols and words separated by colons and semicolons. And that is what CSS looks like. So different syntax, different symbols than what we would use in HTML. Finally, we have JavaScript. JavaScript pretty much looks totally different. So JavaScript has semicolons. We see some of these curly brackets as well as parentheses. We see we're dotting different words together. There are equal signs. We see a keyword that we haven't seen yet. So once again, the big takeaway here is that every language has a different set of keywords and symbols and syntax rules for putting them together. So as we, over the next few nights, explore each of these languages in more detail, we'll be really talking about what are these specific rules for putting these together. But just a little example I wanted to show to get you guys used to this idea of syntax. As well, we are working in a code base. Once again, code bases are really important all the time. If you're actually working on a web app or website, you'll be working with a code base. This one is super simple, just 3 files. I've worked with code bases that have hundreds of files. So code tends to come in these little packets of different related files that all work together towards some end goal. This simple code base here is, of course, all the logic necessary to build this weird little web page with this button that makes some words visible. So there's another example for you guys of some code. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about, which is before we get into really digging into what HTML is and how to write it, is this idea of the software engineering job. So I brought up at the very beginning this really critical question of what makes a software engineer. And in my opinion, it's not necessarily employment, because I've known some really awesome programmers who aren't working in the field at the moment, and I've also known some people who have software engineering jobs but maybe aren't real software engineers. Not to drop shade there, but but no, actually working a software engineering job is a nice part of being a software engineer. So what does that look like? I would hope you guys are asking that, because I'm guessing that a lot of you guys are interested in getting into that world. So as we've pulled out here, I think that looking at a code base is a really great idea to get a sense for what it looks like on the job. So of course, you're often writing code, but a lot of the times you're being handed a code base with code already written into it. And there's this need to kind of poke around and understand what's going on, whether it's to find a bug and fix it or to add a new feature. So as mentioned at the beginning, there's this really critical skill necessary, and that is being able to take something really unfamiliar. Sometimes you are handed a code base in a language you have never worked with before. Sometimes you're handed sometimes you're handed a code base in a familiar language, but it was written so poorly that it might as well be in a language you've never read before. And sometimes it's in a familiar language and well written, but it's doing something really complex. So there's this need to be handed something that looks maybe at first glance like alien nonsense, and be able to calmly break it down and say, okay, I'm starting to understand what's going on here, until you have a deep understanding. In that vein, you are often asked to work on languages you've never worked with before, or use frameworks. As I mentioned before, frameworks are these language add-ons. Oftentimes you're asked to learn these on the spot. And I will say that your best friend when you're a software engineer, and probably the most important skill you will ever learn, is Googling. So software engineering involves having to ask a million questions, and that is what the internet's for. When stuck, Google a question. I will really encourage you guys to do this on the homework. Chances are, before this course is over, you guys will ask me a question that I don't exactly know the answer to, and I might Google it live to just figure it out. So, but the key takeaway here are two things. I mean, really, the key part of being a software engineer is being someone who can learn on the spot, who can work with the unknown, take something that's unfamiliar and turn it into the familiar. So it's a challenging job, but it's a really great job. If you're someone who likes solving problems or always wants to keep learning, then software engineering is a great way to go. And with that in mind, I hope that you guys can all come at all the material that we're going over in the next 2 weeks with this attitude of when you see something overwhelming or unfamiliar or intimidating, seeing it as an exciting challenge instead of freezing and being like, oh geez, I don't know how I'm gonna solve this one. Because I promise you, it doesn't get better, in the sense that no matter how long you're on the job, you're always gonna face problems that just like freeze you in your tracks at first glance. But the growth key is not to know the answer to everything, but to be comfortable with not knowing. So that's a little bit of a side, but I think a really important point. Okay, so enough of me talking about coding. Let's go ahead and start to do some actual coding. So we are going to, for the rest of the night, just look at HTML. And we are going to explore in detail, what is HTML, how does it work, and how do we write it? And by the end of the night, you guys will be able to write a simple web page, which you will be doing for the homework. So that's pretty cool. All right, I'm going to put away this code base example and find somewhere hidden back here is an image that I want. 1 second. Okay, cool. So here is another simple HTML page. And next to it, I have gone ahead and created a diagram of what is actually going on here behind the scenes. So as mentioned, just another review, HTML is the piece of the web development puzzle where we actually put content on the page. So this web page I've pulled up here is only HTML. Notice that it has almost no styling. There is some stuff that is built, some style stuff that is built into the language, such as this header 1 being larger. But for the most part, we see no style. We see no colors. The content is all the way up on the side of the screen. There's no background. It's just pretty bare bones content on the screen. That's how we know we're working with just HTML, because CSS is what creates the styling. So in terms of thinking about what is actually going on here, we want to think about HTML as being a bunch of boxes. So at the most basic level, what we do is we create these boxes, which are called elements. And inside, once we've created a box, we put content inside of it. So within these boxes, we can either put text to put on the screen. We could potentially put an image or a link. We could also put more boxes. And there are different types of these elements, these boxes, and they're all designed to do different things. So over here in this diagram, I've diagrammed out all the boxes that went into making this simple web page. So the first two elements I'm just going to gloss over, and they're called the HTML element and the body element. So the HTML element is the biggest box. Everything goes inside of this. And the HTML element is kind of abstract. It's not something you actually see on the screen. It's just something that kind of exists so that we can put everything else in it. As it were, we won't have to work with this very much in this course. So I wanted to mention it, but we won't talk about it very much moving forward. Same with the body. This is another key piece that we're kind of going to be breezing over in this boot camp. The reason for that is because our sandbox environment, which we'll explore in a minute, takes care of these two elements for us. So these are going to be automatically written for us, but once we start actually writing production code, they're important to know about. So the biggest box that our website goes in is called the HTML element. It's kind of abstract. The body is the next biggest box. This one, it just refers to everything on screen. So notice that there's like yards of white space on this web page here. That's the body. Actually, everything is the body. And so the body is where we start to put all the things that we want to see. So the body is sort of invisible, but it represents everything we see on screen, from the white space to the content. So inside of this body box, now we're going to put a couple other elements. For starters, at the top, we have this header. So we use something called the H1 element, which is a header element to create a new box. And within that box, I've put the actual text that says header 1. So I could put any custom text inside of here. So this header is actually inside of this big old header box. Then below that, I have something called a div, or a division element. So this is used for grouping. Kind of like the body, this thing is actually invisible. So inside of that, we have a P, or a paragraph, which we can see the paragraph text, but it turns out that that paragraph is inside of another box, an invisible box called a div. There's a second invisible box down here, another div that contains our header and our paragraph. So this is another header box and another paragraph box. So let me move this to the side for a second. So these two elements are actually grouped together in an invisible box. And you might be wondering, what is the point if it's invisible? Well, it turns out once we get CSS in the picture, it might not be invisible anymore. So it's good to group like things together. It becomes useful when you start to style your page. So these two are each individual elements or boxes inside a bigger invisible box. This paragraph is in another invisible box, and this header is just hanging out on its own. But it turns out that all four of these, including the invisible boxes, are in another larger box called the body. So that is how we think about HTML code. We think about just organizing our content in terms of just nesting these boxes on the page, some of which will contain actual text that's on the screen, some of which is just used for grouping things together. So that is a little bit about HTML. So let's look at the code version of this. So we've seen this diagram. We have seen what's actually on the page. Let's look at what the code looks like. And that is not the right code. So let's put that away. OK, here it is. Here is the code. So notice that we actually create our HTML element out here. And then inside of that, we have something called the head, which I didn't go over. The head is something that we won't have to worry about in this course either. Excuse me. The head is going to be taken care of for us in our sandbox environment. And then we have the body, which I mentioned over here. And then within the body is everything we really care about. So we can see that there are corresponding to these boxes I've mentioned inside of this diagram, and that we can see some of in the actual page. We've actually written a bit of code to put everything on the page. So corresponding to this abstract idea is an actual code set of instructions telling it exactly what to do. So let's go ahead and pop into our sandbox environment. I've mentioned this term a bunch of times. So now I'll actually show you what it is, and we'll start writing some of these things that I've introduced you to. So, here we go. So this is called CodePen. CodePen is, as I mentioned, a sandbox environment. A sandbox environment is essentially a website that's designed to allow us to write and render code really easily. So as I mentioned before, there's some other stuff we have to do when writing HTML code locally, like in a text editor, such as putting in our HTML element or our body. We get to skip those steps. So CodePen takes care of some of that stuff behind the scenes for us. So we can go ahead and just create a header from the get-go. And it actually appears on the screen immediately. So we can skip some of those steps. And then as well, instead of having to open the file in our browser, this over here will display our code rendered automatically for us. So it's automatically rendering. So sandbox environments, in my experience, are really useful for two things. The first is learning. And because this is a class and you guys are learning, we are going to be using sandbox environments pretty much from here on out. I will use them in the lectures, and you will use them in the homework. So sandbox environments are really great for learning. The other common use case for them, at least in my experience, is for things like debugging. So sometimes I might be working on a big complex production code base and there's just a little chunk of the code that's giving me grief. So if I want to, I can actually copy that code over into something like CodePen and just play with it and get a sense for what's going on without having to deal with all the noise of the big code base. So these sandbox environments are great learning tools, and they're also great for tinkering. They're really useful for just small chunks of code, but they become less useful if you're dealing with a bunch of code. If you have, a production-sized code base, you definitely don't want to put it all in CodePen. It would get very disorganized. So that is CodePen for you. I hope you guys have all created a CodePen account because you will be needing it for the homework tonight. So let's talk a little bit more about this header element that I've created. So as mentioned, HTML is made up of elements. Elements are these types of boxes that are built into the language that we can create to put content in. So one example of a type of element we can create is our H1. That stands for header 1, which means that it is the most important header. So if we want the most important content related to our web page in an H1. And H1s will be, if you're Google searching for something, it will be comparing your search results against, first and foremost, H1s to indicate if your page is relevant. So it's good to put really important, relevant info inside of H1s. We also have H2s, H3s, H4s, H5s, and H6s. And so each one of these, what you would think about as being slightly less important than the preceding one. And notice that by default, the H2 is a little bit smaller, the H3 is even smaller, and so forth. So I did mention that even though CSS is how we style our code, there are a few built-in things such as the different size of the different types of headers. So let's look at syntactically how I created these two headers. For starters, I needed to know the element name. So these element names are built into the language. We couldn't just make up our own. If I wanted there to be a potato type of element, that wouldn't really work. Notice the text still does appear on page, but we're going to create a bit of issues by just making up our own element names. So we want to make sure we're dealing with elements that really exist. I'm going to teach you a few tonight and a few tomorrow. And if you want, you can go ahead and Google them, and a bunch of cool stuff will come up telling you all about HTML elements. I really like MDN as a reference site. It's good for just basic reference. We can see a gigantic list of HTML elements. There are a ton, but we're just going to focus on a couple. So once you know an element name, and you want to pick an element relevant to what you're trying to create. So if I'm trying to create headers, header elements would be great. And then we make a tag. So tags are written just by putting elements inside of these two angular brackets. So I have now created an opening tag and a closing tag. Notice that my closing tag looks just like the opening tag, but with a slash in it. And of course, precision matters, so we can't put the slash in the wrong place or else it won't properly work. So we create an opening tag, a closing tag. So the entire box basically starts with the opening tag and ends with the closing tag. And anything we want inside of it goes inside. So in this case, I'm just putting text inside of my headers. And when it comes to headers, that's usually what you got. You just have text inside of your headers. So there you go, a couple of header tags. And this pattern of opening tag, content, closing is pretty much going to persist with all these elements that we're learning, at least tonight. So let's go ahead and look at a paragraph. So once again, we need to know exactly what the code is expecting. And for paragraphs, we use the tag name of P. So we couldn't actually write out paragraph. That's not a proper tag name in HTML, but P is. So I've created an opening tag, a closing tag, and now let me put some content inside of this. Cool. So now I have rendered a paragraph on the page. So the contents of all three of these elements have been text, but sometimes we want to create sort of an invisible element, such as a div. And as I mentioned before, divs or division elements are used to group things together. So if I wanted that header and that paragraph to be grouped together, I might create a div. Notice that we can't really see anything on the page, but then I will copy and paste these other elements in. So this div element contains these other two elements. So there is an invisible box around those two elements. If we want to see that invisible box, I can quickly pop over here. And notice that, and don't worry about the CSS, we'll go over that tomorrow. But now I have gone ahead and actually highlighted that div box. So what was once an invisible box is now visible. So we can see that even though we hadn't been able to see it before, it was always there. There was this container grouping these things together. So another side note about syntax while we have this up is you guys might have noticed that I actually tabbed over or did a double space these two elements. So that isn't exactly HTML syntax. And what I mean by that is that even if I don't tab them over, the code still runs just fine. It turns out that the code doesn't really care about things like white space. However, we as humans care a lot about white space. And HTML code would become pretty difficult to read if we weren't willing to do tabbing. So by convention, whenever we have an element that contains other elements, we tab them over. It just makes the code so much more readable. And future you, as well as your fellow developers, will be super thankful. So we have now a couple of headers, a paragraph, and a div box containing them. There's one more element I want to introduce you to, and that's called a span. So sometimes we might want to style an individual word or an individual phrase inside of a block of text. So we can put an invisible box called a span on that. And notice that once again, I'm just doing an opening tag, the content, closing tag. So the span is actually within this paragraph. So now there is an invisible box around the word content. Of course, if I want to prove to you that this box is not always invisible, I could sneak over here. And now all of a sudden we can see that this span box isn't actually invisible. So some of these elements by default you won't be able to see, but once we get into styling tomorrow night, you'll see how that's really important. Coming back to this code base example, all these invisible words were made possible by span elements. So spans actually super useful. So those are the, not exactly 4 elements because there are actually 6 headers, but those are the 4 types of elements I wanted to teach you tonight. The 6 headers, paragraphs, divs, which are used to group elements together, and spans, which are used to highlight out chunks of text or single words or possibly even single letters inside blocks of text. So we've talked a lot about the syntax here. I'm going to just go over this one more time. Whenever you want to create an HTML element, you start with an opening tag, then you put content, and then you close the tag. Inside of those tags could be text, or they could be other HTML elements, which might contain text or other things. So that is the formula to writing HTML code. It's this combination of text and tags, basically. And it is really critical you get the syntax just right, and it's critical that you're working with actual HTML elements that exist. So for tonight, just stick with these headers, these divs, these paragraphs, and these spans. We will teach you more tomorrow, and there will be opportunity to look up some of your own as well and expand beyond what I even teach in this lesson. So that is HTML for you guys. So one little skill I want to teach you at the end here, which will be necessary for the homework, is inspecting. So say you're like, okay, now I get a little bit more of what's going on. I want to understand what is actually going on this specific web page. So you can pick any element on the screen, any bit of text, an image, whatever. I went ahead and right-clicked it, and then there's something called inspect. I think in some browsers this is inspect element, but every browser has this. So I hit inspect, and over here this little sidebar appeared called elements. And I know this is really small and hard to see on the screen, so bear with me. I still haven't figured out a way to actually make this larger. That should be a priority for me. I apologize. I've slacked as an instructor. So, but the point is that now we can look at these elements. So we see that this thing I've highlighted is a web page. We can see that there's a bigger div box here. Down here is a paragraph. And within that, we can see that there are some individual spans containing these words. And then finally down here, a button. So we can actually look behind the scenes at any web page we want. I've done this on a pretty simple example page. When you do it on a production web page, it gets a little crazier. So let's go ahead and inspect this element. Notice that the code for the Lambda School web page, as you might expect, is way more chaotic. There are tons of these divs. We can see that this is a H1 and this down here is actually an H2. As we go down, we can see that this is actually an H3. We can see that this thing is something called an anchor, an A element, which we'll learn tomorrow. So one of your assignments tonight is going to involve you guys playing around inside of this elements tab. So you'll get plenty of opportunity to play with this. This is one of those examples where it can be intimidating looking behind the scenes because some of these websites are really complicated. So just stay calm and play around and see what you can learn. So important tool for the homework tonight, as well as just a useful thing to do. I hope that from now on, you guys are opening web pages and thinking about them like developers, asking what elements are on the page, what's HTML, what's CSS, and you can even confirm some of that by looking inside of this Elements tab. All right, so you guys have learned a little bit of practical skills, some HTML, enough to build a little web page tonight. We've also talked a lot in this high-level terms about what is web development and given you guys a nice outline for both what to expect in what we'll learn in this Web Dev 101 course and also in the Lambda main curriculum. And then finally, and most importantly, we've started to explore what it means to be a software engineer. So I want you guys to be really thinking. There are some homework questions that will make you specifically think about that, but I hope you guys keep that mentality throughout the whole homework tonight. And any challenges you have, you view as exciting opportunities to learn rather than intimidating opportunities to not know what's going on. And there will be both. There will definitely be both in your journey as a software engineer. So let me go ahead and go over the homework real quick. As briefly mentioned at the beginning, you guys, if you submitted your info to the Slack bot, which by the way is in the app section of Slack. So down below the list of contacts, there is an app section and the Slack bot is there. So submit your data, you'll be put into a homework group and you will receive the homework shortly after the lecture tonight in your group channel. So no homework will be posted in the main channel, just in the group channel. So let me pull up that homework and show you what we're looking at. So we have the first, so you'll be working in CodePen. So the first exercise is in this JavaScript tab. It's not actual JavaScript, don't worry about it. So this is just reflection. So we want you guys to start thinking about some of these questions about what your goals are, some challenges you're expecting, just a chance to really think about this. Because one of the great things about this free course is it gives you a chance to kind of feel out, like, is this the place for me? Is this the career I want? So this is all about facilitating that. So spend some time actually answering these questions. They will be helpful, hopefully. The next thing is inspecting a website. So this is what I just did, where I clicked here, inspected, and played around. So you'll have some instructions about what to do inside of the inspector. So you'll have a chance to do that yourself in the homework. So these are the two kind of reflection, exploration related assignments. When you're finished, just drag this over, open up, drag over the CSS too. You don't have to worry about the CSS. And then here is little instructions about an About Me page that you'll create. There are a few different elements that are required. And we've started writing some code for you right here. So you'll just kind of dive in with the existing code. You can delete this, you can change it, and then you'll have to add your own. And you can drag this up to see what your page actually looks like. So there'll be some dragging necessary. Make sure you pull this up so you can actually see what you're working on. And then just don't mess with the CSS, and you'll start in the JavaScript tab to answer your questions. So any more questions, you can post them in Slack, but there's a little how-to for the homework tonight. All right, thank you guys so much for sitting with me. It's been a long lecture. Before I let you guys go and work on the homework, though, I want to open up the floor to any questions you have. These can be questions about what is software engineering. These can be questions about HTML specifically, about Lambda School. Whatever you guys want to know, just ask in Slack, and I will do my best to answer it. So I will kind of scroll through and see if we have any questions lingering, but beyond that, I'll be waiting for you guys to post in Slack so I can answer any questions you have. All right. Looking for questions. We did have a question about divs. It looks like some people answered it in Slack, but I will just go over that again really quickly. So yes, so divs are used for grouping. Once again, when we're just writing HTML code, divs can seem kind of trivial. What's the point of grouping? But when we start to style things together, they become really important. Like for example, in this, the reason that I was able to have all this content inside of this box with a border and a background is because all of this content is inside of a div. So even though divs at first glance seem kind of silly, they're actually probably the core building block of most websites. So a little shout out to divs there. We have a question about Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is a CSS framework. So we will not be going over any frameworks in this mini bootcamp. So in Web Dev 101, we won't be talking about Bootstrap. However, we go over it in quite a bit of detail in the main curriculum. Once again, this is a CSS framework, so it's a tool that allows us to write CSS properly. As it were, to use Bootstrap, you have to learn CSS first. So we will be laying the foundation for working with Bootstrap just by exploring the basics of CSS. Okay, a question about the homework. Where do we write the responses in the homework? So just go ahead and write the responses directly in here. It won't let me edit because, oh yeah, that reminds me. You have to fork the homework first. So make sure that you actually fork the homework. So when you press fork, it'll create your own copy of it so that you can edit it so that you don't get an error message like I just did. So make sure you fork the homework. Okay, let's see. We've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to answer as many as I can. Okay, we have, there's a question about linking the JavaScript file from that code base I had up before. So I'm assuming you're asking about this bit of text. So this is a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation, but I think it's an interesting question, so I will just answer it for anyone who's wondering. So when we're actually writing, well, when we're in CodePen, we don't have to link our files together. It happens automatically. But when we're working with a code base, we have to link in our CSS file and our JavaScript file. So this chunk of code here, which you guys don't have to understand in detail right now or at all if you don't want to, is linking the JavaScript file to my HTML page. And the reason that I specifically use the word async here has to do with load time. It's basically saying, wait until all the content is on the screen before you load up the JavaScript. So with a small web page like this, it probably doesn't matter, but it's a good word to use so that your content goes up on the page and isn't slowed down by loading a bunch of behind the scenes logic. So a little bit of an aside, if you guys were like, that was way over my head, don't worry about it. But I just wanted to answer that question for anyone who is wondering. Let's see, what else? Okay, so kind of a question about grading. So we don't have a formal grading system. Because you're working with HTML right now, it should be pretty clear that it's at least more or less working, because you'll be able to see what appears on screen here. But we don't want you guys to be going in totally blind. So if you have some questions about your code, post them in Slack. You'll have an opportunity to talk with your fellow classmates about it after the homework. And if you're really curious about your code, feel free to post a chunk of it in Slack or even message it over to me. It's a little dangerous me saying this. I hope I don't get like 30 chunks of code messaged to me, because I might not have time to look at all of them. But if you have a specific question, please reach out. It's best to reach out in the public channels. But if you want to talk to me directly, you're welcome to message me. I don't always respond right away, though. I will give you a warning about that. So, so there's no formal grading system, but we definitely want you guys to be getting feedback, especially if you're stuck. So do reach out and use Slack as a resource for any place you're stuck on the homework or any questions you have. All right, here is a question just about the Lambda School course. So someone was asking what the schedule is on the full-time course for Lambda School. So I see there's a response saying, check out the Lambda website, a great place to find out more. It is a full-time course. So I believe, hopefully we don't misquote this, but I believe it's from either 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 Pacific time. Everything happens live. There will be a blend of things throughout the day. Not every day has the same schedule, but a combination of lectures, group work, solo work, Q&As. So, and we do leave homework and project time in the day during the Lambda School course. So in that way, you're not having to spend all day at Lambda School and then work even more when you get home. So there's a little bit about what Lambda School looks like. I'll be talking more about little bits of it in lectures to come. If you have more questions about that, just reach out in Slack or check out the website. Karen Zachary is also a great person to talk to about that. And as a reminder, she is the person to talk to with any admissions questions. All right, let's see what else we have in Slack. Sorry, I know I'm skipping a ton of questions. I apologize, but you guys are asking so much good stuff. Let's see. Another question about how to access the assignment. Just a reminder on that, you will be put into a group, a homework group, and you will get a link to the assignment on that. As well, there are links on the syllabus. So if you want to sneak ahead, you can always check the syllabus for homework. Let's see. I'm just going to take a couple more questions, and then we will let you guys go. So how soon will this video go up? I think it takes YouTube about 10 minutes or so to render it, depending. So it's really available almost immediately. So yeah, so you're welcome to go back over this video if you want to review things that you were a little confused on. It's great to use it as a resource as you go through your homework. Let's see. Okay, we had someone ask about the CSS I used in my example. So once again, this is kind of looking behind the curtain. We'll go over CSS tomorrow, but for anyone who has some CSS experience or is curious, here are the 2 lines of CSS I used to make my div have a yellow background and then my span have a pink background. So I know I was kind of sneakily trying to do that. So I do want you guys, especially if you're a beginner, to just really focus on HTML tonight. We will have plenty of time to play with CSS tomorrow. Okay, one more question, and then we are going to be done for the night. It's about submitting homework. So once again, you don't really submit your homework because it's not formally graded. I know that's not fun. Maybe someday we'll be able to formally grade the homework, but we want to make sure that this is free and available to all you guys. So you don't actually submit the homework, just save it on your CodePen so you have it available. And if you have any specific questions about it, post those in Slack and we can give you some feedback or get some eyes on it. All right. I am going to call that for tonight because I feel like the questions are just going to keep coming in. And I love your guys' enthusiasm, but I want you guys to get a chance to actually start coding. So, all right. So that is all I have for you tonight. That was an hour and 20 minutes of a video. So don't be too discouraged. This one is kind of longer and is a little more high level. So moving forward, we're going to be doing a lot more coding in the videos and in the homework as well. But I hope that we laid some great foundation tonight. I think that you guys are going to have a lot of fun inspecting elements and exploring around in the homework tonight. As always, thank you so much for watching live. Thank you so much for all your interaction on Slack. It was great to interact with you guys for the first time. You seem like a really fun, dynamic, curious class. And good luck with the homework. I will see you guys tomorrow, and we will do more HTML and some CSS. So good night. Bye, guys.